Blog Talk Radio.
Good evening, everyone. Thank God it's Friday. We're glad to have you here with us at Metaphysical Media. This week we're going to be discussing Jihadist John, perhaps the world's biggest asshole. We're going to be talking about Jihadist John and that troubadour of that troupe of idiots that are running amok, raping in the name of Allah, pillaging in the name of Allah, and in general just blaspheming everything that's holy about Allah or God. And so we're going to talk about the Islamic State, and I use that term very loosely. I have here with me my dear friend and colleague, whom I'm very proud to be associated with, psychic medium and analytic astrologer, very fine one I might add, Stephen Frampton. Hi, Steve. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you, Stephen.
Yeah, well, I'm grateful that we are doing well. Thank God that we do not live in the Levant right now, because there's a cancer loose in that area. And tonight we're going to discuss the roots of that cancer, and we'll also speculate about the direction of its spread. And it's going to be, in my thinking, Steve, quite a lethal metastasis indeed.
It's scary. It really is scary when you think that ISIS, or IS as they're known right now, the Islamic State, is ferocious compared to even Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda basically disassociated itself from IS, and the fact that it's spanning parts of Syria and northern Iraq, also encroaching upon Lebanon, it's terrifying.
Oh, their plans are to expand northward and take over the whole of Spain. They intend also to capture Greece and the Balkans, and all of the African continent above the Sahara, and even extending below the Sahara. So they have ambitions. However, their ambitions, unfortunately, outstrip their intellect, because one thing that they don't understand is that you cannot rape and pillage and loot your way into a state. The Islamic State, and I use that term loosely, is it lacks any bureaucratic apparatus. It lacks any civil apparatus. Do you see? It lacks all of the trappings of a state. Now, I want to point out, Steve, that when the Prophet Muhammad, peace be unto him, established the first Khalifa, the first Islamic Caliphate, he established at the same time a methodology for effecting a caliphate. Do you see? It's very important, in other words, that before he established the caliphate, he was hiding in a cave. And yet, after he emerged from his hiding, do you see? This is not trivial. This is a very important precursor to a legitimate establishment of a Khalifa, of a caliphate. And the leader of Islamic State, I use that term loosely, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, and I hate to say his name because there's a very, very talented astrologer from antiquity named Abu Bakr. But Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is still in hiding, not like the Prophet Muhammad. So he's not following the doctrinal methodology of establishing a state. And my prediction, Steve, just to sort of shortcut this, looking at all the astrologicals that we'll elaborate on in a bit, my prediction is that the people will turn against him as soon as they realize that this is indeed merely an excuse for debauchery and bloodlust, and it's not a legitimate state, according to the Prophet Muhammad. And the people will realize that. But until they do, Steve, ISIS is going to turn loose through the desert like a ripsaw. And unfortunately, they're quite well funded. I tell you what, shall we begin with the chart for the European mandate, Steve?
Yes.
For those listening, I'd like to go ahead and share the chart details for that. The Middle Eastern Mandate was held, the location is in San Remo, Italy, R-E-M-O, and the date was April 25th, 1920. The time was 11:22 in the morning. And this chart is significant, Steve, because it represents, first of all, the dissolution of the last legitimate Islamic caliphate, the Ottoman Empire. And so the sense that this chart represents the dissolution of the old idea, it also encapsulates the beginning of the new idea, of which ISIS is the manifestation. So this chart is extraordinarily important, Steve. And again, 11:20 in the morning, April 25th, 1920, San Remo, Italy. One of the most important features in this Middle East Mandate chart that I can tell is that we have we have Mars at 17 degrees Libra, applying to the north node at 24 degrees Libra. No, I apologize, I had the wrong. We have Mars at 29 degrees Libra. I apologize. I was looking at the wrong chart, Steve. I've got so many charts here. So my point is that the sign of Libra, this degree range of Libra, is very important to this whole issue, because in the declaration chart, Steve, for the Islamic State, guess what? We have Mars in the same degree range of Libra, and also the North Node is approaching that degree range as well in Libra. So, in other words, these dynamics between Mars and the North Node in both charts link them. Do you see what I mean, Steve?
For sure.
It links them, and to my mind, it really says, hey, okay, Western society, now you guys are paying for the mistakes that you made back in 1920 when you...
Well, we've made mistakes for a long time in the Middle East.
We have.
And I think the most recent one was not getting involved in Syria, and the one that preceded that was our withdrawal from Iraq. Before the nation was stabilized, basically. The fact that members of ISIS are seen driving around in American military vehicles, Humvees, etc., is just ridiculous.
Well, when the Ottoman Empire fell and it was divided, the British and the French and the Allies, in other words, they did not listen to wise advice. They divided the territory up in a way that produced antagonism among the locals. You see, and this antagonism.
Well, I don't think they did it with much respect for tribes.
They did not. They did not factor in the idea that we have a multi-ethnic fabric here of Kurds, and also various branches of Islam, various denominations. Shiite Islam, not to mention all the Nasrani, the Christians, and even the other religious groups in that area. The European powers failed to take this into consideration, and we've been dealing with the flack from that ever since. Now, sort of looking at the chart, I want to share it with everyone. Now, I don't have an exact time for when the declaration of the Islamic State was. However, I do know that the press got it a little bit later. Do you see? So what I know is that they made the declaration, Steve, on the first day of Ramadan, which is the 28th of June. So I cast a chart for Damascus, Syria, for the 28th of June, 2014, and I set the time at 6:26 in the morning. This is when the moon is first visible. This is one of those days where at night the moon is going to be below the horizon. Now this is automatically bad because it means the moon is out of her sect. Okay, this is a classic affliction. So for this day, for this event, the moon is out of sect. She's above the horizon during the daytime. This right here is the first sign that there's going to be something bad. So 6:26 in the morning, Damascus, Syria, on June 28th, 2014, for those listening at home. And what we see, let's compare both of these charts, Steve. What I noticed, first of all, is that we have cardinal angles on both of them. As far as I'm concerned, this right here is guaranteeing that there's going to be a significant change. If you want to establish a lasting state, then you don't elect to do it at a time when the angles are in a cardinal sign. So this was a mistake made by the Europeans during the Middle Eastern Mandate in 1920. Of course, they could care less. They didn't really consult an astrologer. But it's also a mistake made by the Islamic State. And again, I use that term loosely. So I would expect I would expect the Islamic State, no matter how long they last, I don't think it's going to be a significant amount of time. And for me, a significant amount of time is multiple decades. We're dealing with huge swaths of time here. This isn't like, for example, our clients.
The challenge, there are a couple of unique challenges, though, I think, with ISIS as compared to previous terrorist organizations, namely Al-Qaeda. And the first is that they're incredibly well funded. The second is that there are many people with Western passports participating that can return home, and let's face it, return home as hardened killers. The British guy fighting in northern Iraq that brutally executed the American journalist Foley this is somebody that has a British passport. And they say that from the voice recording they'll be able to identify who he is, but if they can't, this is possibly somebody that can just return to their life in Britain, a hardened terrorist and criminal, and bring terrorism home.
Well, I'll tell you, in a bit here, I definitely would like to go into a pretty deep level of detail about the ramifications of all these Western Muslims who are flooding into the Middle East now to join ranks with ISIS, and they number in the thousands. They're a significant legion of Westerners, and I'll have a lot to say about them in a bit. But what I would like to point out right now is that in the chart of the Ramadan declaration of the Islamic State, I think that what you're describing, Steve, is shown by the 10th house in the sign of Cancer. The Cancer being the sort of the homeland, the moon in Cancer. And I remember a previous version of this chart before I had some software problems that screwed it up. The moon is in Cancer, and I remember thinking even then, wow, that really feels like a Western or a type of an American sort of a signature. Because the sign of Cancer is so American.
Stephen, tell me again what time you had for the ISIS chart.
I'm using a time of I'm sorry, 6:26. I was looking at the wrong chart, Steve. Jesus Christ, I've got so many charts here. Yeah, you're probably confused. I was looking at.
Well, the ISIS chart, if I've got the information correct, is from you is 26th of June 2014, 6:26 a.m. Damascus.
It is.
But I think you're right to you might have been looking at the wrong chart. I don't think it matters because the point is that there's a lot of energy in Cancer, and you're right there because the Sun is in Cancer at 4 degrees, the Ascendant is in Cancer at 16 degrees, Jupiter is in Cancer at 25 degrees, and the part of Fortune is in Cancer at 2 degrees. What is, I think, hopeful about this chart is that Jupiter's in the bends to the exact degree, which is highly unfortunate. It means that at some point in time, this entity will be unfortunate. Hopefully that means it won't last.
Yeah. Steve, actually, one of the reasons why I keep looking at the wrong chart is because I have two charts for ISIS here. I went ahead and cast a chart for the time when the moon is culminating in the midheaven, and that was at 1:28 p.m. Yeah, 1:28 p.m. in the afternoon. The moon was culminating, and so that's why I keep getting confused on the chart. So I have two charts for that event, Steve.
Okay, no worries.
Sorry about that. And both charts are my logic behind this is that, well, if the moon rise chart is significant, and I hold that indeed it very much is, because Ramadan. Let's keep in mind here. Islam descends from lunar cults, just like Judaism does. Okay, and so they are very, very much tied to the moon. They operate on a lunar calendar, just like the Jews do. We operate on a solar calendar. So, for Ramadan does not begin at the same time at every place. It begins when the moon rises. You see, on the first day of Ramadan. And so I cast a chart for that moment, thinking it would be symbolic and heavily significant, and I still think that. But I also reasoned that if I cast another chart at the time when the moon is culminating and it's up there at the top of the sky for everybody to see in the middle of the day, I reasoned that that chart would also be significant. And indeed, they're very similar because the angles in both Ramadan charts are angular. Cardinal signs. You know what I mean? The angles are in cardinal signs for both charts. And also in the Mideast Mandate chart. So we're dealing with three charts here. The Middle East Mandate chart is what I consider to be the root chart. And the Islamic State announcements are the natural consequence of those root charts some 100 years later. You see, and so that's what we got going on here. And, of course, these three charts are worthwhile to compare to the national charts of Iraq, of Syria, etc., of the UK.
Well, Syria is a particularly interesting case here because when you take the sunrise chart for ISIS and you compare it with the Syrian chart, there's some very interesting synastry. Firstly, they've both got pretty much the same ascendant.
Yeah.
And also the moon in the Syrian chart, the common people, is conjunct Jupiter in the ISIS chart, which in my mind means that somehow and I think we'll figure out somehow the establishment or the declaration of ISIS, of the Islamic State, will be fortunate for the common people of Syria. And when you look at Mars, I mean, that real feisty Mars in Aries in the Islamic States chart, it's conjunct the south node of the moon in the Syrian chart. And I believe that what that's indicating is that ISIS's declaration of an Islamic State, the dreadful murders, their hideous violence, beheading people with swords, and particularly recently recording on video the beheading of Foley, the American journalist. What they've done is almost given us now a better justification for also tackling Syria militarily.
Yeah, and we had a chance to do that, and it could have been a situation where we would have nipped this in the bud before it had a chance to blossom. But I think at the end of our involvement with Iraq, we had a changeover in the presidency. We had an ambitious young president who was sort of making history, and he wanted to be the guy who brought an end to the violence in the Middle East. He wants to be the guy who brokers peace among the Jews and the Arabs. He wants to be the guy who brings the troops home. But I think that was pretty much premature. I really do think it was premature. If you want to avoid an Islamic State sort of situation. Now, it could be possible that our leaders in this country aren't taking the Islamic State seriously, because it's easy not to take them seriously. As I said before, they are not acting like a state. They can't. They're looters. I don't
think we are. I don't think we are.
No, we're not taking them seriously. We should, though.
Well, I think we're starting to. But I've said before, I'm not a foreign policy expert, but I worry about U.S. foreign policy and British foreign policy, European foreign policy. But let's face it, it's pretty much led by U.S. policy. But I saw an announcement, a short video clip of Chuck Hagel, the Defense Secretary, yesterday evening, and in honesty, it almost served as a reminder to me that he is the Defense Secretary, because we haven't heard. I don't feel, and I follow the media a lot. Because I'm interested to know what's happening in the world. And I saw this little video clip of Chuck Hagel, and, we've seen so much from John Kerry that I'd almost forgotten who Chuck Hagel is.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh gosh, all of a sudden now we're getting you think of all that's been going on, and now at this stage all of a sudden we've got these comments from Chuck Hagel, which, to be quite honest with you, I think in the game, because the Middle East is in absolute turmoil. I think arguably it's worse than it's been in God knows how long.
Oh my God,
Chuck Hagel's comments were pretty much, ISIS represents the greatest threat. And I was thinking, really? You don't say? And I was it just gave me the impression that a bunch of people who got together over a brandy or something and started to cobble together a commentary that might be the beginning of a coherent or coherently articulated foreign policy.
Well, I think Chuck Hagel. He's
about American foreign policy.
Chuck Hagel is one of the more interesting Obama nominations, because he was, in my opinion, a very clear sign that President Obama would be rather anti-Israeli in his approach, which for an American to be anti-Israeli, that means that it doesn't mean that he dislikes Israel, but it is obvious to me that when he appointed Chuck Hagel, that President Obama perhaps was willing to at least not blindly cave in to all of Israel's demands. Now, of course, the president, we criticize America, we criticize Barack Obama for saying that not supporting Israel in some of its more drastic actions, but and then turning around and selling them weapons. But we have to keep in mind that President Barack Obama has the Congress to deal with, and the Israelis, they have influence in the Congress. You see what I mean? And so the Israelis can circumvent the President of the United States of America and go directly to the Congress. And so this of course is a deplorable state of affairs. The Israeli nation should have absolutely no influence whatsoever in the Congress of the United States of America, and it should be purged. But that's another topic. It's related, of course. But President Barack Obama appointed Chuck Hagel. You don't hear too much from him, and
you really don't. You
no,
really don't. And you don't. And it's not like it's some quiet time. It's not like it's a particularly peaceful time.
Yeah.
And therefore there isn't much to be addressed by the Defense Secretary. It's a dreadful, dreadful time globally. And as you said, we haven't really heard a lot from Chuck Hagel, to the point that I was stepped back and thought, oh yeah, of course, he's the Defense Secretary.
Well, if you set up a synastry chart between, for example, I'm looking now, Steve, at a synastry chart between the United States, the Sivli chart, and the moonrise Ramadan chart for the Islamic State. And wow, I mean, if you look at this synastry, you can see that these two forces are destined to butt heads, because the ISIS figure heavily concentrates its planets, its luminaries, into the American seventh house of the enemy, and all of America's grouping of planets in Cancer and its warlike Mars and Gemini, they all fit into the Islamic State's 12th house. So this synastry says, wow, these two nations are at odds, and it just tells a really, really complete and accurate story as to what's going on this day and age. I mean, the American Mars is enshrined to the Islamic State Mars, which will facilitate airstrikes, because Mars is in an air sign here. And, in the 12th house, that really the 12th house traditionally is associated with the besiegement of cities and fortresses. And, having this grouping of American planets in the Islamic State 12th house is a perfect delineation of America to the Yazidi people who were being besieged at the mountain by these butthurt, religious, deluded idiots, the Islamic State. Go ahead.
Well, I was just, I really want to make some observations to that point, but we mentioned Obama,
right,
and I think it's really interesting to compare the ISIS chart with the United States chart, partly because, when we're at the end of Obama's second term,
right,
and it's very interesting to see how the situation's developing, because it does seem pretty clear that Hillary Clinton is going to run for president. If she's not, then I can't understand why she would be in the media so much at the current time. I mean, we hear more from Hillary Clinton than we do from anybody else, I think, at the current time. So it looks like she's certainly warming up for something, although she says she's still undecided, but I'm not convinced by that.
They all say that.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that it will be interesting to look at the ISIS chart, or the ISIS charts, in the context of presidential candidates when we know who's running, because I do think that foreign policy failings, or perceived foreign policy failings, will be really played up in the presidential election, the presidential campaigns. And what's interesting, Stephen, is that Hillary Clinton made a comment about, she used the word failure, I think, in reference to Syria and Obama's original decision on Syria. And in actual fact, I've said before, and I say it again, I felt for Obama on the Syria front, because I felt it was John Kerry that threw a spanner in the works there by saying in the media, oh well, if if Assad didn't have his chemical weapons, then we wouldn't need to intervene militarily. So Putin jumped on that and said, oh well, no problem, we can fix that. So that was addressed, and all of a sudden Obama no longer really had a mandate to go into Syria. I'm surprised that John Kerry survived that faux pas. But what is interesting is when you compare Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama's charts, remembering that Hillary Clinton said that she made some reference to Obama, Syria, and policy there. She used the word failure. And then there was a lot of information in the media saying, Hillary Clinton said that Obama's policy is a failure. And apparently she contacted him and said, I didn't in any way want to criticize you or put you down. But when you compare Obama's charts and Hillary's chart, and you see that Hillary's south node of the moon and Mercury are at Obama's midheaven, and her Jupiter is up there as well, and you also see that her Mars and Pluto embrace his sun, I wonder whether she'll be forced in the presidential campaign to actually say, well, yes, I do think it was a failure. I do think it was a failure we didn't go into Syria. I do think Obama should have chosen otherwise. And I don't think that ISIS would be as powerful or as problematic as they are right now if it wasn't for that decision. I wonder if somehow she will be placed in a position where she has to criticize Obama. The charts suggest that may be the case, but I think it will be very interesting as well to consider the ISIS chart, Stephen, in the context of Hillary Clinton's chart, because the Republican, apparently the latest is that the Republicans are implying, or they've realized that a good angle for them to spin would be, if you want more of Obama, vote for Hillary.
Yeah.
I actually think that's very clever, because I think a lot of people are tired of Obama, and I do have some good things to say about him, but let's be honest, he hasn't got high support and high public support, and I think that she will have to demonstrate that she is not Obama, that she's going to have different policies, and I think she'll really be put under pressure when it comes to foreign policy and the original decision over Syria. And it will be interesting to look at all of that dynamic and how ISIS plays into, in effect, the presidential campaign.
I think that's a very provocative question that you raised, Steve, because I've noticed something very interesting. In the spectrum of American politics, the right and the left, it's the conservative right that is going to be liable to lobby against action in the Middle East, believe it or not. Do
you think? I'm surprised by that. Why?
My prediction is that they will actually lobby for more, if for any military action on the American border with Mexico. My theory here is that the more conservative one becomes, the less enthusiastic one will be about action in the Middle East. Because it's a collective sort of impulse. In other words, if you consider yourself conservative, you're going to hear your conservative cronies voice this, and then you're going to parrot them. And then B, the reason I say the conservative people will go in this direction is because they are starting to increasingly adopt an America First policy, and they're starting to quote, as is all national. If you look at all nationalistic movements, they always quote the forefathers of their country, and that's what's happening now. You see these quotes all over the place. It's almost a cliche. If you look on Facebook, you can barely scroll down Facebook if you have any conservative friends without seeing a quote from Thomas Jefferson or George Washington, warning us against the Federal Reserve, warning us against foreign entanglements, quote unquote. So my theory on this, Steve, is that the liberal people are going to be advocating for military action in the Middle East and not the conservative. So that means the Democrats would be more liable to do that and not the Republicans. And that's just my speculation on the matter.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I agree, Stephen. I hear where you're coming from. I understand the rationale, but I'm thinking that the Republicans are going to point out Obama's failings, and they're going to point out foreign policy, Syria, Iraq, pulling out of Iraq, the Islamic Caliphate, raging and the most ferocious, dreadful terrorist organization we've ever seen. And they're also going to really play up the fact that Obama hasn't been particularly friendly with the Israelis. They will really use that situation to as a bargaining chip in the process. Sure. And I think that Clinton will be forced to do some of the same. And the other thing I believe, Stephen, is that, and all respect to the founding fathers, they did wonderful things, and they created a wonderful nation when they created the United States. But we live in a different world, and I think that to put America first, to put Britain first, to put the world first, we have to go and deal with ISIS. We cannot live with this situation in the Middle East. We cannot tolerate it. And I think that the problem nowadays is that the borders are becoming irrelevant, because when you've got Americans and Brits that are fighting and cutting people's heads off with swords in the Middle East, they can just zip back home potentially unless they get spotted. Then boundaries, borders start to become very blurred and almost irrelevant, because terrorism can be brought to the United States. And so I feel that, firstly, I feel that we have to deal with ISIS. And I think that if the Democrats didn't start saying ISIS is a huge threat, we've got to do something about it, then they would be absolutely hammered by the Republicans over foreign policy.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with you very much so there, Stephen, in your statement that we're going to be forced to deal with the Islamic State. Because looking at the synastry between America and the Islamic State, we have Uranus conjunct the fourth house of the American chart. The fourth house is our soil, is our territory, it's our homeland. To have Uranus and Aries conjunct the fourth house cusp, to my mind, that is a delineation match for a terrorist attack on the soil, on the homeland. The midheaven of the Islamic State is in the third house. That's definitely a delineation match for the publicity of the Islamic State. The midheaven is their actions, their deeds, their reputation. So that's a delineation match for posting the videos of these primitive, ungodly acts onto YouTube, all the press that they've been getting. If it were that alone, if it were not for Uranus conjunct the fourth house cusp, I would say, let's not worry about the Islamic State. The media are just their only action, midheaven, it applies to our third house. It's a cadent house. It's a weak house. It deals with publicity, rumor. But however, we do have that Uranus there, and that Uranus is indeed conjunct the nadir, the fourth house cusp. And so I'm thinking, that's definitely going to correspond with, some American jackass returning from what is essentially, a live version of Call of Duty. You know what I'm saying? And he's going to come back to America, and we're going to see Uranus and Aries, what it's really all about.
There's no doubt that in the remainder of this decade, we're going to see another significant terrorist attack on the United States. I don't have any doubt about that.
I tell you what.
I think going back to sorry.
I was just going to point out real quickly, Steve.
I was going to say, Stephen, I think. Yeah.
No, I'm sorry. We got a little bit of a delay here. Why don't you go ahead and make your point? I can. I got a good memory. I can remember.
I was going to say I think that the reason Hillary Clinton's kept quiet about her intentions for the presidential election is because she knew that Obama's made some bad decisions, and she didn't want to come out in public and say it. But she knew that there would be consequences for those decisions. She knew that there would be consequences for that bad decision over the lack of intervention in Syria, and she knew that that would cause problems. And here we are, Islamic Caliphate, including beheadings, etc. And so she decided to buy some time to see how Obama's policies would cause him problems, so that she could then determine what her policies would be when she's put on the spot and asked specifically what her policies would be.
It's interesting. Let's return to the seventh house dynamic of this synastry, Steve. And, we can see here in the synastry.
Remind me again which one you're looking at.
Oh, sure. I'm comparing the charts of the United States of America, the Sibley chart, with the Ramadan moonrise of the Declaration of the Islamic State, 28 June 2014. 6:26 in the morning, the moon is rising. It's just above the ascendant. And comparing these two charts, we see that the American grouping of planets in Cancer, it corresponds very tightly with a similar grouping of planets in Cancer for the Islamic State. This to me shows a number of things. A, it shows the proximity of the Islamic State's soldiers and its generals with our own government, with our own people. Look at the moon in Cancer for the Islamic State. That represents the common people of the Islamic Caliphate. And look how close they are to the president, which is represented by the sun in Cancer. Look how close the moon is to the president. This, to me, makes me think that, advisors from Iraq, for example, that might counsel us on the movements of ISIS, they're probably going to turn right around and give information to the Islamic Caliphate. What we have to keep in mind here, Steve, is that we're dealing with a version of Islamic messianism, okay? The idea of a khalifa, a caliphate, this is a holy thing. We cannot underestimate the religious fervor that this is going to arouse in even moderate Muslims. I want to emphasize that. It would be a huge mistake to lose sight of that fact.
The idea of having an Islamic caliphate.
Absolutely. That is, it's tantamount. It's comparable to the Christian idea of the rapture and the tribulation. It's a holy thing. They lust after it. Your doctor, your lawyer, your accountant, Jihadist John. Let's think about Jihadist John. Everybody remarks about how, quote-unquote, well-educated he is. Well, let me tell you something. Even somebody as dumb as Forrest Gump will say, educated is as educated does. So, Jihadist John might have, a bunch of degrees, but he's about as educated as my Cocker Spaniel Max, that son of a bitch. And he's going to die. The American government is going to take his life.
But what? It's quite fascinating, Stephen, about the U.S. Sibley chart and the ISIS chart, whichever of the two you choose, that somehow, I don't know, this isn't so bizarre, because it doesn't make sense to me logically. I can't rationalize it, but it is somehow something that I'm observing in the charts, that somehow ISIS represents an opportunity.
Your thoughts on this, Steve?
For the
Okay, Steve. Sorry, man. We had a bit of a Skype issue. We're back.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
It's okay.
You got interrupted. Please elaborate on your last comment.
Well, there's, on the one hand, you see that that ISIS and the United States are very unfortunate for each other, because we've got Saturn at 14 degrees Libra in the United States Sibley chart, which is conjunct 16 degrees Libra in the ISIS chart.
Yeah. So
there's no doubt about the opposition, the conflict. But then you've got things like Jupiter in the ISIS chart is conjunct Mercury in the Sibley chart, and the Sun in the ISIS chart is conjunct Venus and Jupiter, the benefics, in the United States chart. So it somehow, to me, I'd be interested to get your take on it, but it somehow indicates to me that this could somehow end up as beneficial for the United States.
You know what, Steve? I don't really see it that way, and I'll tell you why. The Sun in Cancer is Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Oh, we got a train coming through. Sorry about that. Why don't you go ahead and talk, Steve? I'm going to mute this real fast, okay?
So you see, I'm just thinking, you see the Sun in Cancer as the leader of ISIS.
Right. Now, Jupiter, the American Jupiter in Cancer, that's the upper crust. That's the nobility. That's, for example, your radical Muslim physicians, your accountants, your business owners, etc. Now, Venus in Cancer Venus is a universal significator for Islam. So what this grouping tells me, what this configuration tells me, with the Isis Sun interacting with the American Jupiter and the American Venus, I'm gonna nutshell this thing for you right now. Here's Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Brethren who are living among the kafir. You know, in other words, the leadership of ISIS is arousing anti-Western sentiment, pro-Islamic sentiment among the Jupiter, the upper crust here in the West, and also, you know, he's using the Venus, the love of Islam, in order to affect that. Now, also, this grouping of planets in the 7th house of the American chart also tells me that America is not going to be able to avoid getting into bed with some of her historic enemies on this one, Iran, even Syria. Minister Cameron over in the UK just got finished making a very, emphatic rejection of Bashar al-Assad's offer to help out here. You know, Assad, the president of Syria, probably would love all the help he can get. He's looting huge tracts of his real estate to these Mideastern rednecks. Okay, fine.
Yeah, he's not worried about the 191,000 people that have died. So.
No, and that figure is probably
well, it's underestimated.
right. So that we can be very confident that it's easily crested the 200,000 mark by several dozen thousand. Now, like I said, this grouping of planets in the 7th house tells me we're not going to be able to do this on our own. Look at the Isis Mars. Okay, at 17 degrees Libra, it's conjuncting our American Saturn in Libra. So in other words, to me, this represents the Congress authorizing airstrikes. Mars is in Libra. The Congress is Saturn in Libra in the American chart. That's the Congress. Okay, to have the Isis Mars transiting over that shows congressional authorization for the use of American force. And so, you know, I would expect that to probably continue. You know, Mars is separating from Saturn, but he's still definitely up there. You know, and he's opposed to Uranus as well.
I hear you, and I do hear you. I see where you're coming from. I think, though, that ISIS does somehow benefit the United States because they create justification for us going back in and dealing with unfinished business, and they've created a justification as well for us to get involved somehow in the dreadful conflict or civil war in Syria. Because let's face it, if you're bombing ISIS positions in northern Iraq, northwestern Iraq, and they trot over the border into Syria, you're telling me we're not going to bomb them just on the other side of that border just because they crossed an invisible line? We're absolutely going to do it. And I think, therefore, that's the benefit that I'm seeing here in this industry. And so simply put, that ISIS has created a justification for us to go in and do what we actually wanted to do in Syria. It's just a delayed effect, unfortunately, because of the whole decision not to get involved in Syria because of the chemical weapons discussion or debate. I think, Stephen, that there's somebody that I've got a lot of respect for is Navi Pillay. I hope that's the correct pronunciation of her name. She's the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. And she spoke up against Israel and said that Israel may have committed crimes against humanity recently in Gaza. So I quite respect her for being strong enough and to say that. But she openly and strongly criticised the United Nations Security Council, saying that it failed to prevent conflicts around the world and that it's divided. It's not a united group that's making the right decisions. And she actually said, you know, that they could have avoided hundreds of thousands of deaths around the world if they'd been more effective. And if I were wearing a hat, I'd take it off to Navi Pillay for making this observation. Unfortunately, she's ending her term, and a prince from Saudi Arabia is taking over.
Well, it's very
and we all know, I mean, Saudi Arabia has a wonderful record on human rights.
Oh, yeah, sure. They love to behead people.
How?
Mm-hmm.
How is it that a prince from Saudi Arabia is taking over the United Nations High Commissioner role for human rights?
Easy. As far as I'm concerned, that event is also encoded in the Islamic Caliphate chart. Let's examine Venus and Gemini in the 11th house. The 11th house is the house that designates the United Nations, it's organizations. You know what I mean? Venus is a woman. So that's as far as, and it's in Gemini, an intellectual woman. To me, that's a delineation match for Miss Navi, and also it's also a delineation match for the prince, because Venus represents youth, and now it doesn't matter how old the prince is; he's a prince, not a king. You know what I'm saying? The luminaries would represent royalty. So, and also Venus, as I've mentioned, is the universal significator for Islam. So, in that post, we're liable to find a succession of Muslims or people. I don't know what.
Well, I've got no objection to, and I know you're not saying that I have got an objection.
Oh no.
I'm just saying that for the record, I have got no objection to a Muslim being in that role or any role. I don't care whether a person's a Muslim, a Jew, black, white, green, pink, orange. I honestly don't care. And I don't care what their faith is. What I care is that they're actually going to do the job that they're appointed to do and do it well. And I don't see how a country like Saudi Arabia that does not have a good record on human rights and women's rights.
Yeah, well, it's ironic.
How is it that they have they're going to take on that role?
Politics, probably.
The answer is politics.
And it's also, I still strenuously argue that the answer is also astrology. No, I'm not criticizing, the idea that a Muslim could occupy that position. What I am saying is that with Venus at the 5th degree of Gemini in the 11th house, I'm saying that sets an archetypal stamp or a mold for a succession of followers of Islam to fill that particular post. Or, at the very least, it's saying that Muslim issues in the United Nations are going to be emphasized. And again, it's a very clear symbol for Navi as far as I'm concerned, because it's Venus, a female, in Gemini, an intellectual sign, in the 11th house of organizations and dreams and values and morals, etc. So, I see, to me, that's very clear. It's very, very clear that Venus and Gemini represent sort of a generic placeholder for, UN spokesperson, as far as I'm concerned. And that degree, very interestingly, is conjunct the United States 6th house cusp. So, in other words, the functionary is going to be speaking out about American 6th house issues, American sicknesses or weaknesses. So it's very interesting. And if you're curious, you pointed out the irony here, that a nation that has a really bad track record for human rights is going to be accorded such a lofty position in the United Nations. Well, we can see here, it might, even as ridiculous as it might, and ironic and paradoxical as it might be to do that, the astrology says it will be done, and indeed, so it has been. Something interesting. This is the important thing. A lot of times, astrology just does not make sense. It goes I can't tell you how many times with my clients I've come across a configuration as, oh my God, that can't be right, and so I approach it cautiously with the client, and I find out that my intuition on the matter is totally wrong, and that the chart is right.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, you think to yourself, this. I remember I had a client the other day, and I know this client, and I was thinking, she can't be bulimic, surely not. Right. And it just came out of my mouth, and she said, "Yes, you rumbled me."
You can never tell with anyone. I mean, studying this literature of the ancients, studying my textbooks, you always come across things like, if such and such a configuration happens, then one sibling will kill the other. If such and such a configuration happens, then verily the father will kill his son. And you think, man, that's impossible. But it happens. Just ask Marvin Gaye. It happens. People, terrible things happen. And so it's all encoded in the natal figure. And the whole story of ISIS, start to finish, is likewise encoded in its chart. You look at, for example, if we want to consider the territorial gains that they've accomplished, that story is told by Mars applying to the North Node in the 4th house of territory. You see what I mean? They're going to. That's a very bald statement that, hey, these guys are going to profit. They're going to gain increase, North Node, through warfare, Mars, on the homeland, on other people's homeland, fourth house. Very, very clear. And it's in opposition to Uranus. Now, that Uranus, as I've stated before, is conjunct the American fourth house cusp. So the action, the movement of the ISIS army in the lands of others is going to cause that Uranus and Aries to come into existence. And, I argue that this Uranus and Aries represents Western jihadists who will go fight, and if they survive, I hope they don't, they'll come back, like hemorrhoids to the West. And they should never probably have ever been allowed to come here in the first place. The second hour of the show, I'd like to talk about what America should do, can do, probably will do, and things of that nature. And really, this whole ISIS episode is going to. I mean, it implies.
It's just your worst. It's just the worst nightmare, isn't it?
It is the worst nightmare.
It's a nightmare.
I mean,
interestingly, Stephen, there is an eclipse in the October 8th eclipse, the lunar eclipse, is exactly conjunct Uranus and Mars in the ISIS chart.
Right. Yeah, that's going, and you know what? That's going to be
squared loosely by Pluto.
It's going to be significant after the date of the eclipse. Believe it or not, its effects are going to be felt afterward. But it's definitely going to be significant, especially considering the sign and the nature of the planet involved, and just the nature of the eclipse. Which, I mean, the eclipse references. I mean, it's the meaning sort of baked into an eclipse is change. And Uranus already means sudden and unexpected change already.
Well, one thing that I find comforting about the ISIS chart is that Uranus is at 16 degrees Aries and the south node of the moon is at 24 degrees Aries. So it's not going to take a long, long time for Uranus just to transit up to that south node and hopefully wipe them out in some manner.
Check out the Middle East mandate chart. Look at that Venus. Take a good look at that Venus.
Let's have a look.
You're going to like this. You're going to see the value of this Middle East mandate chart here in just a few seconds, my friend.
I've got it here.
All right. Look at Venus. Look at her degree.
16 degrees Aries.
Yeah.
It's amazing, isn't it?
The cycle. Now, Venus is a fast-moving planet. What are the chances that in 1920 or 1925 or whatever, that Venus is going to be occupying the exact degree that Uranus is occupying today in 2014 in reference to this problem? Now, this chart shows what I'm arguing for strenuously here, Steve, is the notion that astrological cycles represent seeds that blossom into fruit. And when the cycle ends, the fruit has decayed. And the seed sort of changes its form, and it goes out again. And this cycle never ends. The seed effloresces, and it dies. And a new seed related to the old one arises out of the ashes. It effloresces, it blossoms, it bears its fruit, whatever that fruit might be, and it dies. And the cycle repeats itself. And so what we're dealing with now are simply the results of this chart. This chart is telling us.
Doesn't, though, the conjunction of Uranus and the ISIS chart, the fact that it's conjunct Venus and the Middle East mandate, it basically blows up the whole original vision or concept for the Middle East.
Well, first of all, it's in the 10th house, and it does indeed blow up the whole concept of the Middle East as that concept pertains to the Europeans. Do you see what I mean?
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Let's look at the house placement here in the 10th house of the Middle East mandate chart, which is the government, which is Britain, France, America, etc. Venus, Islam, is in Aries, so that means automatically that the actions of the government, 10th house, are going to really piss off the Muslims, Venus and Aries. Right there. I mean, that's just as plain as day. And when is it going to? When is the most pungent manifestation of this going to happen? Well, we get that answer from the Islamic State chart when Uranus, like a second hand on a clock, hits that degree of Venus. Boom. And look at that. Uranus is also angular in the 7th house. So, it's impossible to deny the pertinence of that root chart, the Middle East mandate chart, and it's impossible to deny its pertinence to this question, to this matter in 2014. And indeed, as all astrology does, it shows the ending as well as the beginning. The end is wrapped up in the beginning, and so that's where we stand with that. And in the Middle East mandate chart, we have the other signatures of Mars. Oh, I'm sorry, Yeah, we have Mars again in an air sign. We have Mars only in the Middle East mandate chart. We have Mars only a few degrees away from the North Node. So the correspondences and congruence between these two charts, between the ISIS chart and the American chart, are just out of this world. I'll tell you what I'd like to do, Steve. Let's change tack here a little bit and see how ISIS stacks up against the United Kingdom, because Britain has supplied quite a number of young men to the fight.
400 is the current estimate.
Oh, that's a low estimate, man. That's been revised now to over 500, to around 500.
Stephen, I would like, if possible, if we do have time later.
Sure.
And I know that we said that we would. Well, we said that we're focusing on terrorism today, and so that does include Hamas.
Yes, it does.
I would like to check in on Israel and Gaza, because there have been enormous developments. I mean, we said that eclipse would be triggered in the middle of August, and it has been. The peace talks fell apart, and Israel has gone back into Gaza. The military leader of Hamas, his wife and child were killed in an air raid, and also 3 senior Hamas leaders were killed. A number of people were then executed in Gaza, people who were apparently informants to the Israelis. But now the Israelis are furious because one of the rockets, Hamas rockets, has killed a 4-year-old boy, which strengthens their determination. And I think it would be worthwhile checking in on that situation as well, because that is as hot and as problematic as ever.
It breaks my heart whenever children are inveigled in the stupidity of their parents, and I feel very badly for that Israeli family that lost that beautiful child. Steve, but you can multiply that by about 464 times or so, and you'll get an idea of the Palestinian.
I was going to say, and I'm not going against the Israelis. I mean, honestly, I've said before, if you were hurling rockets at my home from your land, your plot next to mine, I would do something about it. I would not just let you carry on doing that because you've got a kid. I would want to address that situation. So I understand why the Israelis don't want to just sit back and accept rockets.
They're going to have to find another solution, because if you fire rockets at my house, I'm not going to kill 500 of your children. You know what I'm saying?
But this is. I was coming to this point because before you made that point, I was going to say it is dreadful that this 4-year-old boy died. But how many children have died in Gaza? So that was exactly my point, and I think that it is just dreadful that children are caught. Well, anybody's caught up in these conflicts other than the people actually wanting to fight. Right.
Well, I'll tell you what, Steve. We'll reserve maybe the last 35-40 minutes of the show, and we'll see what's we'll evaluate Israel and Gaza now in the light of these new developments. Hamas just admitted to the abduction and murder of the 3 Israeli teenagers that started off this whole crap.
Well, that was obvious.
Right, but I do have a couple more comments to make about ISIS before we do move on, and especially in relation to the United Kingdom chart, because Prime Minister Cameron said, the phrase he used was "no boots on the ground." Well, let me tell you something. With transiting Jupiter, at some point this year, I haven't checked the actual ephemeris date. This is very easy to confirm when we check the ephemeris date. But my guess is that when transiting Jupiter conjuncts the UK Saturn. Okay, and I'm using an 1801 chart for the United Kingdom.
So you're looking at the United States and ISIS now, the United Kingdom and ISIS.
Right, and Steve, I'm using the Union of England, Scotland, Wales, and North Ireland from January 1st, 1801 at midnight, set for London.
Yeah, that's the chart that I use.
And I have Saturn at 23 degrees Leo. It's a very close to the Saturn placement in Israel's chart, which that to me verifies the fact, or shows the fact, symbolizes the fact that of the Balfour Declaration, that the Mideast Mandate affected by the British is essentially what allowed the Israeli state to come into exist. Do you see? But that's another topic. We'll get to that in a bit. My point is that as transiting Jupiter conjuncts the United Kingdom's natal Saturn, Prime Minister David Cameron is going to change his tune, because see, Saturn in Leo is going to deny. That's a definite delineation match. It's in the 11th house of the UK chart, the Parliament or the House of Lords or whatever it is, and so that represents the government denying war. Okay, no boots on the ground. But when Jupiter gets and conjunct Saturn, my prediction is that this is going to change, because Jupiter.
Well, you know what was strange, Stephen?
What's that?
That Obama said no boots on the ground, and he said again this week no boots on the ground. But there was a report in the media that the U.S. is now considering land-based military action.
They're not going to have a choice.
And I looked at it and thought, well, we're saying we're not going to do that, and we're saying it right now. We're saying right now that we're not going to do that. But now there are rumblings that we are, and I think you're right. I think that we will have to.
Yeah, and as Jupiter conjunct Saturn, and again, this goes back to that cycle I was talking about earlier. This is one of many cycles. Now, this is what's referred to as a Class C cycle, because it's fairly rapid. You know, the cycles of the outer planets are extremely slow moving. They can encompass centuries. But the cycles of Saturn and Jupiter are approximately 20 years. So as Jupiter is conjuncting Saturn, this is the beginning of a new Jupiter-Saturn cycle, a new seed, a new idea that's going to bear new fruit. And so my thinking is that Jupiter, which stands for liberation, permission, liberality, is going to conjunct Saturn, and could very well ease that no boots on the ground policy. That's what I'm thinking it will in fact do, and I don't think we'll have a choice, considering, again, Uranus and Aries on the fourth house of the American chart. To me, that's a match for a possible explosion or terrorist incident on American soil due to these potzers and schmucks coming back from the Middle East, which we should never allow them to do. You know, when I was a kid, Steve, my mom would say to me, in or out, bud. You're not going to come in here letting the air conditioning out. You get your butt inside and play, or you go outside and play. America needs to do the same thing with those people immigrating here from Syria, Iraq, etc. If you come here from Iraq or Syria, you're not going back to visit your family. It's a permanent thing. And if you do go back to Iraq and Syria, you're not returning here ever again. Your citizenship is stripped, etc. That's the approach that's going to be necessary, and even that won't be enough, Steve, because already here we have so many enemies integrated into the fabric of our society.
Well, exactly. It's too late.
It's too late. Now, again, I bring to bear the Sun in Cancer in the ISIS chart interacting with Venus and Jupiter in the American chart. That's, to my mind, that is a definite recruitment campaign in the West for Muslim jihadists.
Yeah, and I think, though, it is, Stephen...
And they'll do it, too.
It is important to say, though, that there are many, many, many Muslims who are settled in the West who are just as disgusted by what we're seeing as we are. So we're talking about a minority.
I'm not prepared to say that at all, buddy. I disagree with that. I disagree with that totally.
That's my opinion. But I do agree that the problem is that those that are not this way are absolutely interwoven into our communities.
No, one thing I want to point out to you, and I mean, I'm not an expert on Islam, but I do know a bit about it. I've studied a little bit about it, and the Islam, in our religious tradition, in the Judeo-Christian religious tradition, it's a commandment not to lie, but it's the exact reverse. In Islam, one is allowed to lie if it's going to assure victory over your enemies. And we have to bear in mind that Islam is even more aggressive when it comes to proselytizing than Christianity was. So my theory, my opinion on the matter is that there's going to be a lot of moderate Muslims who, in their heart of hearts, are going to be yearning for the implementation of a new Islamic Khalifa. And if that were not the case, Steve, then ISIS would not exist.
But even one that is killing Muslims?
Oh yeah, I mean Muslims aren't. I mean, they talk. The jihadists, the extremists, they talk all this stuff about brother this and brother that. But I mean, we should all know. I mean, biology tells us that organisms, the closer an organism is to another organism genetically, then the more hatred it will have for that organism. I mean, this is in nature, so it doesn't surprise me one bit. If this is the way a lot of these religions work. You either believe as I do, and again, if you're a Shiite, and you believe in the coming of the 12th Imam, then you're just as bad as a kafir.
I do remember that some of the people that were fleeing in Iraq were saying our neighbors, people that we thought were friends, were threatening to kill us.
Yeah, and I feel bad for those legitimately mild or moderate Muslims, but increasingly I think the phrase moderate Muslim is an oxymoron, and no, it's just extremism is just sort of baked into that thing, man. And I don't understand, because what I would like to point out to all of the people in the Islamic Caliphate is that your actions prove the impotence of the God that you worship. Why is your God so damned insecure? Why does he get so butthurt everything? If he had even a modicum of power, he would not need to be getting so angry just because somebody drew a cartoon, or just because somebody drank alcohol, or just because somebody walked out of the house without a freaking burqa on. I mean, seriously, is your God that weak and insecure and jealous that he can't stand to see the sight of a woman going outside of her house and showing off her hair? So I don't think these people understand how their actions actually, instead of honoring God, demonstrate his impotence. It's a paradox that I don't think these fools have stopped to consider. This John the Jihadist, no matter how quote unquote well educated he is, he doesn't understand that by sawing off the head of another human being, he is demonstrating to the world that the God he worships is a eunuch.
Well, he's demonstrating to the world that he's not of God. He, as an individual, is not of God, of Allah at all.
The whole movement of the Islamic Caliphate, the whole movement of jihadist Islam, in my opinion. Now, this is just my opinion. I mean, I didn't wake up in Iran this morning. I have a right to my opinion.
What's the name of the wonderful girl that now lives in Britain? She was in Afghanistan and she was shot in the head for wanting an education. I can't remember her name off the top of my head. She's wonderful. She spoke at the United Nations and she spoke all over the place. But she said, and she's worth listening to, she has said, these people are these terrorists. They are not true Muslims. They are not representative of the average Muslim. This is not what our faith is about. And I would say that, this British Muslim who severed the head of Foley on camera this week, he's not of God. He's not of Allah. He's one of those people that fall under this description that she gave us, which is that these people are not Muslims. These people are animals. They're not of any faith.
Steve, I titled this show Islamic Satanism and the Illegitimate Caliphate. And my theory, my argument here is that the entire movement of the Islamic State is satanic. That even though they profess loyalty to Allah...
Well, I think that, Stephen, I would agree with you when it comes to the Caliphate. When it comes to ISIS, I would agree with you. But I think it's maybe, well, I don't know. I'm not sure that I would begin the title with Islamic Satanism. I think that absolutely I'd use the term Satanism very freely with regard to ISIS, but not generally with regard to Islam.
Why not?
Because as that girl said, this is not Islam. This is not Islam.
Steve, every time I turn on the television set, I see, in fact, that it is indeed Islam. I mean, I'm sure she's a nice little girl and everything, and she probably plays with Care Bears, and I think it's great that she wanted an education, and I think it's awful that somebody shot her in the head, and I thank God that she survived. But for her to say that this is not Islam, I mean, I respect her opinion, but she's a child. She's a minor.
Well, she's a child, but she's a child that has stood up, Stephen, on behalf of children that all over the world that aren't getting an education. And I believe, yes, she's a child, but she's got an important message, and I agree with her message. These people, these animals that are cutting people's heads off in Syria or Iraq or Afghanistan, anywhere, they are not the typical Muslim. And I know that you've had friends that are Muslims. I have friends that are Muslims that are wonderful people, and so I don't believe that they're representative. Just as I don't believe that this British guy that severed Foley's head is the typical Muslim resident in the United Kingdom. They're a minority, in my opinion, and unfortunately they're a dreadful minority. But I don't think that we can say that this is Islam. That's not true.
Well, first of all, the idea that simply by belonging, and I know you're not making this point, but it seems to be a commonly held belief in the modern world that simply belonging to a minority of some sort automatically elevates one to a position of moral superiority. But I don't believe that at all. First of all,
well, I wasn't saying that.
I know you weren't making that point, but I would just like to say this much. Looking into the Quran, one can divide the verses into roughly two categories: the part of the Quran that was composed in Mecca, and the remaining part of the Quran that was composed in Medina. Now, there's a distinct difference between these verses, and in fact, the difference is formally recognized by scholastic Islam, and the verses from Medina are referred to as the verses of the sword. Because in the verses from Mecca, Islam is, conforms to the statements of the little girl. It's loving, it's peaceful. Allah forgives and is merciful. But then in the verses from Mecca, Allah starts to have a serious attitude problem. And they are extraordinarily violent verses. They tell historical stories of, for example, beheading hundreds and hundreds of Jews living in this or that area in Saudi Arabia. And, just terrible. I mean, it's not to call those verses holy is a stretch of the imagination.
But Stephen, it's like the Bible. I don't believe that everything in the Holy Bible is the word of God. The word of God.
Nor do I.
It's a product of man.
Yeah. First of all.
And you could, we could take the Bible and pick out all manner of things that we feel are wrong.
Right. Yeah, I don't
think it's just about the Quran. I mean, I haven't studied the Quran, but I would like to. I know that there's a lot of great merit in the Quran, just as there is in the Bible. But there's also a lot in there that was politically motivated.
Well, my point here is that the violence that you see exhibited by so many factions of Islam springs directly from the verses of the sword in Mecca. From these verses, we get the Islamic exhortation to lie to the Kafirs in order to conquer them. This is doctrine, you see, and so my point, I would like to remind everyone that just because immigration laws are what they are right now, they can be changed. And it's my opinion that they should be changed. They're entirely too lax. To me, it's a violation of common sense to allow your enemy to integrate itself into the fabric of your society. And then, it boggles my mind. Why on earth would Britain allow it?
The problem, I'm quite liberal, but even so, I've spoken up quite a lot about the ridiculously lackadaisical immigration policies in the UK. I mean, a few years ago, you literally just trotted over into the UK, and you got a house and satellite TV, and you couldn't find a job, things would be paid for, etc., etc. The British have made a lot of mistakes on the immigration front, and in my opinion. But I think, Stephen, the problem is, how do you identify your enemy?
Well, in a problem like that, you're just going to have to operate sort of a blanket type of, and America's not going to like this. And unfortunately, that's not my problem. This
goes back to, in my view, it comes back to a spiritual question and philosophy, which is, for example, we've talked about Ebola, and we said how awful that we started to wheel out how awful that we didn't start to wheel out the possibility of the anti-Ebola drug until some white people got Ebola. And I take my hat off to the young guy, the doctor who was in Liberia that was brought back to Emory in Atlanta, and who, thank goodness, has now left hospital and is doing well. I take my hat off to him, and I'm very grateful that he survived. But I think it was shameful that we weren't really doing a lot collectively about Ebola until white people started to get it, and until there was the threat that it could come to the West. And to me, that's wrong, because it doesn't matter to me if you're black and living in Africa or you're white and living in Manhattan. You're part of me, and I'm part of you. And it comes back to me, in my mind, it comes back to the spiritual truth, which is that if people are being raped and killed in the Middle East, I do consider it somehow my problem.
Well, astrologically, there is a justification for the existence of Mars. You see, it's not an accident that Mars is included in the pantheon of astrological symbolism, because Mars is necessary for life. Sometimes it's not good 100% of the time to adopt this attitude that I am you and you are me. Sometimes it's very much necessary for survival to say, you know what, you are you and I am me, and never the twain shall meet. I mean, we were dealing with idealism on one hand and practicality on the other, and these are just my opinions. These are just my opinions.
But the practicality, but Stephen, the practicality as well is, I mean, I get said this is my spiritual philosophy, but putting spiritual philosophy aside, the practicality of it is this: if you allow people to die of Ebola in Africa in this day and age, you're inviting it back home, because we don't live in a time when people don't intermingle.
Sure.
And if we allow ISIS to be roaming around in the Middle East, then we are allowing a problem that's going to come and bite us in the ass as well. So I think whether we look at it from a spiritual perspective or from a practical perspective, we have to do something about it.
Oh yeah, no.
In my mind, I'm coming back to the point that we have to do something about ISIS, and I'm just very frustrated that our leaders have only recently come out and stated very clearly, oh, yes, we have to deal with this.
It's too late, unfortunately. ISIS, the upper echelons of ISIS, the rank and file of ISIS, they are too deeply intermingled in our society for us to separate them. So what we're looking at here is our own selves that are raping and pillaging the entire desert over there. We're looking at our own selves here, Steve, and that's what makes it so difficult. So in a way, it's really too late. My idea of cracking down on immigration from these groups and nations that are traditionally our enemy, just out of common sense, that idea, unfortunately, is too late for implementation, because they're here now and they're going to come back. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So, unfortunately, there's nothing we can do about that. The bad things that I saw in the charts here, they're probably going to happen, Steve, whether we like it or not.
Well, let's go back before we move on to Gaza and
Sure.
And Israel. Let's go back to an analysis or discussion about what we feel is next with regard to ISIS, terrorism and ISIS. How would you like to do that? Which charts should we use to consider, well, what's next?
Okay, well, I'll tell you what. Let's start with let's start with the Middle East mandate chart. Let's do a solar return for that bad boy. What do you say, Steve?
Sure. Okay.
Because that chart, and my argument, my theory here, is that chart definitely still applies. It's still active, in other words. It's still acting and making things happen right now, today. So let's see what the solar return charts are. Okay, 1 second. While I calculate that. What year is it, Steve? Just kidding. You don't have to answer.
2014. I wrote a check today, 2008.
Jesus Christ!
I know, and I had a client that was born in 1991, and I looked at her. I was like, well, what? You were born in 19... I thought, damn, I am getting old.
Yeah, man. Well, I'm about to turn 39 here in a bit, so we're both aging together, but we're still considered to be young astrologers. Okay, we work in a profession that venerates age, so we're still babies. So I tell you what I'd like to do is first of all, I want to find out where the profections are for the Mideast mandate, I want to find out
I've
what.
just run the solar return. It's got a nasty grand square.
Okay.
Oh, it's got a horrid. Damn, it's got an exact grand cross.
Oh, see?
It's got a grand cross. It's got Pluto at 13 degrees Capricorn, squaring Aries at 13 degrees. So there you go. Cardinal grand cross. Yeah, this is going to be rough as hell, basically, isn't it?
It is. Now, interestingly, this is an 11th house year for the Middle East. Okay, so that means that Venus is the Lord of the year. The reason I bring this up is because next year is going to be a 12th house year. It's going to be
nice.
Yeah, it's going to be even worse than this year. And Mercury is going to be the Lord of the year for next year. But hey, we're not in next year yet. We're in this year. So let's find out where we're at. Their birthday was on April 25th of 2014. So April to May.
I've got 24. Oh, the nearest solar return was April 24.
Right. I'm looking at
11:33 p.m. and 4 seconds.
Right. I'm looking now at the root natal chart here for the profections. And I'm just let me do a quick calculation here. So we're in April, May to June, June to July, July to August, July 25th to August 25th. So this, right now we're in the profected natal ascendant of this Middle Eastern chart is encountering the Moon in Leo and Jupiter in Leo. That's why things are, being really violent, because Jupiter and the Moon in Leo are going to expand and cause an instinct and a love of war. Next month is going to be really shitty because Saturn's there. The month after that is going to be really shitty because Mars is there, okay? But Mars, that fourth house month, okay, let's calculate. April to May, May to June, June to July, July to August, August to September to October are going to be terrible, are going to be pretty bad months. September to October especially, September 25th to October 25th, I would expect probably an increase in bombings, like air raids, of us air raiding them. However, because I would expect them to increase their gains for territory in that month, September 25th to October 25th, because this is the month where the natal part of fortune is at in the Middle East.
I think that what they'll actually do is they'll say, right, screw you, we'll go in a different direction, we'll go towards Lebanon.
Oh, yeah, I can't, for the life of me, I can't understand how Lebanon has been exempted yet. But they're definitely due. I mean, seriously, if we don't nip this in the bud, then not only is it going to be...
Do you know what that means, though? Once they start having to go to Lebanon...
They're going to get Israel.
Not far from Israel.
Yeah, and they're going to go after, as I mentioned before, they intend to enter into Spain as well. So
I don't believe that they're going to get that far.
No, but they intend it.
I know.
That's what they think they're going to do. They also think they're going to take over Greece. Are we still here, Steve? Hey, Steve, did we get cut off, bro? You know what? I think I'm going to take the CEO of Skype and force him to join the army and send him over there to fight against ISIS. Okay, not sure if we're back here yet. Let me see if I can get Steve back. I'm very sorry, everyone. We are having such a terrible connection with Skype. This is just unacceptable. Okay, we're back. We're very sorry about that. Let me get Steve back here with us. you know what? He's trying to call me in at the same time. Okay, everyone, we are back, and we do apologize for that. We're having some technical issues. Steve, are you with us?
I am.
Okay, sorry about that, my friend. We're going to take Skype CEO and force him to join the Army and make him go over there and fight ISIS, huh? Okay, well, we're back, and where were we before before Skype so rudely interrupted us? We were talking about the solar return of the Middle East Mandate, and we were sort of forecasting what the future trajectory of this conflict. And were you saying something before we got cut off, Steve? Did you want to make some observations here on this solar return?
Well, just that it's got a cardinal grand cross in it, which is astro speak for oh shit.
Well, yeah. Also, we determined that Venus is the Lord of the Year for the Middle East, and she's in the 12th house, exalted in the solar return for the Middle Eastern Mandate. So that's also very very unfortunate for the region. And certainly no surprise that we're having these problems. Next year, Mercury is the Lord of the Year, 2015 to 2016. Let's see what that year is going to be like. Mercury's placement is in the 11th house in Taurus. Taurus has to do with money, has to do with land and buildings. And being in the 11th house, close to Mars. Mars in Taurus represents destruction of the land, Steve, destruction of crops, destruction of banks, etc. And this is an 11th house sort of deal. So this, to my mind, it reinforces the notion that 2015 to 2016, we're going to probably be occupying that place or very close to it, perhaps. Mercury, Lord of the Year, also rules the 12th house in the 2015 solar return. So in both years, from 2014 right on up to 2016, we're going to have that 12th house emphasis, which is traditionally malefic and a bad thing. So it's going to be bad. It's going to be bad. Also, we have Saturn in Sagittarius retrograde in the 5th house. To my mind, this also references repeated bombings, repeated airplane raids because of the nature of Sagittarius. So we know what to expect from these guys. ISIS is well funded. They have they have a big army. I can tell you that right now. I did a horary question on this matter, Steve.
Oh, yes, let's take a look at that horary. We did say we would look at that, and I think we've got time to do that before we move on to Gaza and Israel.
Sure, okay. So I asked the question, will the Islamic State be destroyed? You see, and the resulting horary is the answer to that question. Now, most of the time when you do horary, Steve, you assign significators. You assign the 1st house to one group and the 7th house to the opponent, and you see which one's stronger. But there was an ancient way of evaluating this specific type of horary chart, and I got this from Guido Bonatti, and Guido Bonatti himself got it from an astrologer named Saul. And essentially, you take the whole horary chart and give it to ISIS, right? The first chart represents the first house represents the person who started the war. It represents why they started the war.
Saturn in Scorpio.
Yeah. That's the
Pluto on the cusp.
So that's answers
pretty much ISIS.
It answers the question of why they started to begin with, and who they are. The 2nd house shows, in fact, whether there will be a war or not, whether they'll have the wherewithal to press to prosecute their to prosecute their claims and to wage war. And indeed, with Saturn, the ascendant ruler and the 2nd house ruler are the same. It's in the 11th house, pretty strong. So yeah, there's definitely going to be a war. The 3rd house shows what weapons are going to be used, Steve. Now we have Pisces there with Neptune. What does that say to you? Repeatedly, retrograde. What does that say to you?
Chemical weapons. Chemical
weapons. Very good. Yeah, that's exactly what it says to me as well. It also says to me, naval warfare. So I'm getting this picture of destroyers in the Middle East, in the Mediterranean, firing all sorts of goodies and Christmas presents onto ISIS. And so it represents...
If we'd done that with Syria, ISIS might not be knocking around.
Right.
I think I've made that point. I just need to get over it, don't I?
No, you don't. It's a very good point, because it's going to be repeated. I mean, we see this constantly. I keep harping on this idea that we're in a cycle. We see it constantly, where America will get involved with the opposition to who their current Middle Eastern enemy is. They arm these people, and then a decade or so later, the people we arm.
Yeah.
So
it's Saddam Hussein.
Sure. So if we armed, for example, the Kurds in Iraq, which would be a pretty good idea. Probably 20 years from now we'd have a major problem with them. But anyway, the fourth house shows where the conflict is going to be waged, and it's in a hot, dry place, Aries. It's in the desert. And Uranus is there in Aries.
And an unfortunate place, south node of the moon, conjunct the 4.
Yeah, ISIS is going to suffer a lot of decrease in the homeland. They're going to lose territory as the war progresses, a lot of the territory they gain. The Uranus retrograde in Aries in the 4th house references repeated explosions on their home turf. The 5th house would represent the cities of the place, and, those are in Taurus. The 6th house represents the material.
Holy sites.
And holy sites, absolutely, shrines and things like that. The 6th house represents how the army gets around, and that's pretty clear there with Gemini on the cusp. And I'm using whole signs for this horary, Steve. With Gemini on the cusp and Mercury in the 9th, it makes me think that the material, the Jeeps and whatever trucks and stuff they purchased came from a 9th house source, a foreign source.
They're ours.
Yeah, they're ours.
We paid for them. Our tax dollars paid for the stuff they're driving around in.
And not to mention donations from various probably Islamic, quote-unquote, charities here. And so anyway, the 7th house, according to Guido Bonatti, represents, quote, the rocks and missiles that might be hurled. So we can adapt that to reference RPGs and things of that nature.
There's going to be a lot of that because we've got the 2 benefics there.
Right, we do. And, the moon represents the common man, with an RPG. Do you see what I mean? Firing at the ascendant, however. Now, this could represent, the common man as in the Kurd, firing an American supplied RPG, at ISIS. Now, the 8th house in Leo, would represent typical 8th house things: the spreading of plague, the spreading of death. And ISIS is very good at that. And, using whole signs, the entire sign of Leo is on the 8th cusp. We see Jupiter there. That's death to Christians because Christianity is Jupiter is the universal significator for Christianity. But hey, guess what? It's death to Muslims too because Venus is there. You see, so it's also the death to very important people as shown by the sun. The 9th house represents reconnaissance gathering, intelligence of the enemy. Look who we got there. And the whole sign, we've got Mercury exalted in Virgo. Okay, American businessmen, British businessmen. Also, if you use a house cusp system like Porphyry or Placidus or Alcibiades, the 9th house is in Libra, and we have the North Node there. So there's a great amount of increase through foreign sources, a great amount of increase through reconnaissance and intelligence gathering, spies, etc., that are in the foreign lands. This is very clear to me how ISIS is operating, Steve. This is not true. I'm not just pulling this out of my butt. The 10th house shows Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leadership of the ISIS, and their ability to organize, their ability to lead. If you switch back to whole sign, we see that Libra and the North Node are in the 10th house, and so that also confirms that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is an able organizer, an able general, and has able underlings. He will have increase through them. And we switch back to cusp house systems, then we also get an alternate picture of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi that shows his darker side. We have Mars there in Scorpio, and this is a very competent Mars because he's in the sign that he rules. He's strong in the 11th house, also Saturn. So this is
sneaky as well. Mars is, I think that Mars is interesting because it functions different. Well, it functions differently under Aries than it does in Scorpio. And there's something particularly criminal and underhand and nasty about that Mars in Scorpio at 15 degrees. And I think the 15 degrees is a powerful spot. Well, it's also 15 degrees, 15 minutes. So we're talking real nasty, underhanded, dreadful character here. But hey, you don't need to look at a chart to know that he's a scumbag.
Here's what I want to point out, though, Steve. Mars in Scorpio is a coward. Okay, Mars in water signs is timid, unless you put his back against the wall. Then he reacts with extreme cruelty. Now, of course, Mars in Scorpio is also a very blatant symbol for naval warfare as well. So, they don't have a navy. So perhaps this could definitely reference...
They're going to get to know ours.
Or they could reference chemical warfare as well, being in a watery sign, etc. Mm-hmm. Now, also, Mars in Scorpio represents surgery. So I would expect Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi to have some serious medical issues with Saturn and Mars, Scorpio.
Let's hope so.
Let us hope so. And anyway, moving on to the 12th house, Guido Bonatti and Saul say that the 12th house represents, quote, besiegements of castles and fortresses and the like. And it's in Jupiter's sign. Jupiter is again the universal sign of Christians. And here we see besiegement, besieging of Christians and others, and the Yazidis, for example, on the mountain, etc. And so this is a very good snapshot of ISIS. And looking at this, my idea on it is that the people are going to realize that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi does not have the authority of Allah behind him, and the movement will fade. This is not a genuine caliphate, a khalifa, and they'll gradually lose popular support, especially as they start getting shelled into oblivion.
I know, but it just brings me back to the thought: how the hell did we let this happen? How the hell did we let these people take so much territory? How do we watch that happen?
It's easy for me to forgive the government, knowing as I do the astronomical underpinning of this whole situation. I see it as completely faded. Now, not totally deterministic. We mishandled the earlier part of this cycle. We mishandled the cycle, and so now the cycle's just repeating itself, and we're just we're reacting in sort of faded, knee-jerk types of ways. I've said it 1,000 times. The collective is very much more faded and has less free will than the individual. So America as a collective is sort of shoehorned into manifesting the dynamics we talked about and referred in the charts here. There's no way. Is it avoidable? Practically it's not. But there's a breath of possibility that somebody, the entire nation will say, "Wow, we should really, change our direction here." That's not likely to happen. What's more likely to happen is that the narrative is going to progress exactly as the symbol systems we've talked about tonight say it will happen, which means that the violence is going to increase. There's going to be terrorist attacks on domestic soil in the UK or in America because of returning jihadists. The recruitment activities of ISIS are going to bode ill for our country, et cetera, et cetera. We've covered this ground, and we know what to expect. We know that probably the next 2 years for the Middle East are going to be violent. We're not going to be able to dodge these. And you know what, Steve, my thesis is that these events would have happened even if we had bombed the snot out of Syria, even if we had gotten involved in Syria, even if we've done this or done that. The planets are going to, if they can, they're going to manifest what they signify, if at all possible. The only way they won't manifest what they signify is if they are in a cadent house or afflicted somehow or rendered unfortunate, and then the action of the planet will be perverted. For example, Mars in Libra, that's an affliction. Mars is in the opposition to the sign that he rules when he's in Libra, and therefore he's in the sign of his detriment. So this means that Mars, instead of acting in accordance with his nature, which is bold, is going to act like a coward. His nature is going to be perverted due to this affliction, you see. So it's a very stimulating chart to ponder, and it's quite scary. But tell you what, Steve, it's about we got a few minutes here. Let's scoot across the desert and visit Israel and see what we can expect from that fiesta.
So what the chaos that's occurring over there towards the Mediterranean?
Yeah. Let's it's. I hate to read about all the terrible tragedies involving children over there, but as you know, Hamas announced today that they admitted to absconding and murdering the 3 Israeli minors. And thus kicking off the whole thing. And we earlier a few weeks ago, way back in July or late June or whatever, we said here on this show that from approximately the middle of July until the middle of August, there was going to be a ceasefire, and that around the middle of August, that ceasefire was going to come to an end. And almost right on, and so it proved almost right on time. Israel announced that it was ending the ceasefire, or Hamas. Jumped the gun.
Israel announcing that Hamas had ended the ceasefire.
Effectively, the peacefire definitely came.
Ceasefire, rather.
Ceasefire, yeah.
I was saying peacefire as well.
Yeah, that actually is more descriptive of what's been happening, isn't it, Steve? A ceasefire punctuated by violence, then another ceasefire, then more violence, then another ceasefire, etc. But what is going to happen next with these people? What's going on next with Israel? What's going on here? What can we expect in the coming months with Israel? These are all very good questions. And so let's turn to some solar returns for the state of Israel, bearing in mind that this is a seventh house year for Israel, which means that issues having to do with seventh house matters, enemies, opposition, war, etc., are going to be highlighted, and so it turned out to be. That's definitely no surprise. So, looking at the solar return, Venus is Lord of the Year, and she's in the sixth house. This is bad. She's in Aries at 13 degrees away from that 16-degree critical mark that we identified earlier. That's also bad. Let's go ahead and make it clear what Venus at 16 degrees of Aries is saying. It's saying that Muslims are going to become irascible. That's what it's saying. And it was saying that from the Middle East Mandate chart back in 1925. And all it was waiting was for, as John Addy, author of the Harmonics book, might put it, as all it's waiting for is the final wards in the combination lock to fall into place. And so we see Venus ticking along here, and probably as she approached the 16th degree there, things got nasty for Israel. But here's the solar return figure. Now, looking at these things, we can see at a glance probably which months are going to be the difficult ones. Let's see where the Israeli ascendant is. And it's in the first house, I would imagine it is. And, that would, right there, would mean also that the Israelis are going to be getting back in touch with their own national identity somehow, which make them, formidable opponents, which may, sort of explains their response to this problem, as it were. They're having, the natal ascendant is in the solar return ascendant, you see. So this is a reinforcement of those ideas. Now, the natal ascendant ruler, let's look at that, because that's going to show where Israel's mind is going to be at this year. The natal ascendant ruler will be Mars, and Mars is at 28 degrees of Leo. So let's see where that falls in the Israeli solar return for this year. Where is 28 degrees of Leo? Aha, that's in the 11th house. So that tells us that Israel is going to be preoccupied with the entire year on organizations such as the UN and international watch groups, etc., that are going to be bedeviling them due to the way that they elect to prosecute this war.
Denied access to Gaza.
Denied access to Gaza, and a whole bunch of a laundry list, really, of what can be termed as only human rights abuses in terms of killing children. They're guilt on both sides here. But the natal ascendant ruler, his spot in the 11th house, that shows that 11th house matters are going to be important. Not only organizations such as the United Nations, but the 11th house also pertains in a national chart to the cabinet or the Congress or in this case the Knesset. Do you see? So this puts the Knesset on center stage as well. Do you see? So that all is definitely shown in the solar return figure. Next year, they're going to be having an 8th house year, Steve. 8th house years, as you can imagine, are also fairly negative. When you have a 6th house year, an 8th house year, or a 12th house year, you're not going to be wearing your everything's going to work out for the best hat. It's going to be a worse year than usual. So next year is going to be worse than this year for Israel. The sun, well, hold on. The 8th house is actually, Mercury is going to be the Lord of the Year. And in this chart, he's in the 6th house. This is a bad configuration. And his aspects are. He has some good aspects, but that's not necessarily a good thing. So let's find that all important 28 degree of Leo, because that's where the Lord of the Ascendant is going to be at. Leo. Okay. Oh, come on, don't tell me we lost it again. You still there, buddy? Jesus. Okay, we're back. Steve, you there?
Yes, I was just thinking, let's pray that ISIS will be about as effective as Skype.
Oh man, you hit my man. I'll your Capricornian sense of humor, because when you get it, man, you really just dig your thumb right into that funny bone and just press, man. I swear that tickled me. We're gonna have to find a better solution for affecting these things, man. Skype is just irritating.
Yeah.
It's giving me a case of the ass. Well, anyway, I was just lamenting about how crappy a year Israel is going to have next year as well. So.
Well, I'm just looking at the natal chart progress with the transits, and I'm not looking at all the eclipses. I'll have a look at it in a moment. I'm sure that there's an eclipse on the Israeli ascendant, or was it that there was an eclipse on the Israeli ascendant? I can't remember.
There was.
But we need to keep it. Yeah, well, no, but that wasn't the ascendant. That was the Israeli south node conjunct the Palestinian Pluto. But you can see here that transiting Mars and Saturn in Scorpio are not too far away from an opposition to the Sun in the Israeli chart, and also transiting Pluto is approaching the progressed Moon. So we certainly aren't seeing an end to this situation.
No, those oppositions with the Sun are definitely going to stress out the leadership of Israel. And Steve, you know, in the Time Lord system of the Fir Dariyat, Israel is in the Mars Fir Dariyat. You see, this is a 7 year period ruled by the planet Mars, and therefore
7 years of conflict potentially.
Right, it's not going to end until May the 14th, 2018, when they enter into the Fir Dariyat of the North Node. That will probably represent a bit of a 3-year reprieve from these issues, but the worst is yet to come. And
there is on the eclipse front, the April 15th eclipse was on the ascendant.
Right, okay.
And therefore squaring the progressed Sun.
In my opinion, that eclipse presaged
I agree.
What happened this summer.
Yep.
Now, when Israel enters into the Fir Dariyat of the South Node in May 14th, 2021, that's going to be an extremely difficult 2-year period for them. So probably the next 12 years are going to be very challenging for Israel.
Well, it ties up with our forecast that the late part of this decade and the 2020s will be exceptionally problematic.
Right. People could level the charge at us that, hey, we're finding the things that we want to find in these charts. I would defend myself against that very, very valid criticism, because you have to guard against that by saying that, you know, wow, if we see a certain signature in one chart, you can charge us with confirmation bias, perhaps, or, you know, scouting out what we want to see in the figure, because that's possible. You know, if you look at your natal figure and say, you know, I'm going to be on American Idol and be a star, you can find that in your birth figure if you look hard enough. You know what I mean?
I don't agree.
Oh, yeah, I can definitely agree. Well, obviously, I can agree with myself.
I'm glad you agree with yourself. You're consistent. All of your personalities are consistently in agreement with you.
It does not happen often, Steve. We should mark this moment down and commemorate it.
That was like a bloopers moment.
Right. Well, anyway, my theory here is that, you know, if someone is properly deluded enough and motivated enough, one can pretty much scout out anything one wanted to find in the chart. However, the way that we work is that we operate on combining signatures in a wide variety of charts, and the charge that we are simply finding what we want evaporates under this idea, because for any one nation, we're looking at, you know, 6 to 10 charts for that nation, and when we see significant correspondences, you know, such as exact conjunctions of degrees, you know, and things of that nature, you know, that's it's unavoidable. You know, we can't argue that, as far as I'm concerned.
I think the challenge is simply the amount of information, the amount of data that we're working with. So people say, how come you can't predict all the dreadful things that happen in the world? And the answer is, well, sadly, I don't have the resources to review all of the data. Yeah,
a world watch of that sort.
I barely have enough time to look at my chart.
It is certainly research intensive, Steve. And you know, as time goes on here, you will be able to do that. You know, the earlier phases of metaphysical media, especially, are more concerned with helping our audience to get acquainted with sort of like the root level of all of these nations. You know what I mean? We're engaging in some forecasting right now, and that's great. But as we go on talking about these nations more and more, then we and our audience are going to come to know them as almost individuals. We'll know their solar returns. We'll know their perfected ascendants. And we're going to have a very good idea ourselves, and all of those who listen to our show, we're going to have a very good idea of what to expect in the world in the coming years. So if you don't like spoiler alerts, do not listen to us.
To that point, the eclipse in March 20th of next year in the Israeli chart squares Uranus.
Yeah.
And Jupiter, so they're in it for the long haul.
They're definitely in it for the long haul. I mean, again, they're going to be in the Mars sphere area for the next several years.
You might just have kicked off World War III for us unknowingly.
God, let's hope not. Now, by being in the Mars sphere area, that simply means that the planet Mars is going to be the Time Lord over that 7-year period. It does not mean that they're going to engage in 7 years of nonstop warfare. You know, Mars is a very complicated. Its symbolism is very complicated, and also it has to be adapted to Mars's position in the Israeli chart, which is at 28 degrees Leo. So during that whole Mars period, Mars is going to be essentially keeping his promise to Israel. His promise is to give them definition in life because he rules the ascendant. Okay, and his promise is also to give them whatever is signified by Aries. His promise is also to give them, most importantly, what's signified by his placement in Leo, in the 10th house. Mars in Leo is going to defend honor. So all throughout this entire 7-year period, Israel is going to find itself defending its honor, both against Hamas and the world in general. Israel is in a situation it can't win. If it reacts too softly with Hamas, people will call them fools. If they react the way they've been reacting against Hamas, people will call them murderers and Nazis. So they can't win one way or the other. It's an unwinnable situation that they're in. So they might as well just be practical and tell the rest of the world to, go eat rocks. I mean, what else can you do? If you're Israel, do you see what I mean? Now, unfortunately, it's just such an intractable situation, Steve, that it's impossible almost to predict a good result here. You know what I mean?
Well, let's face it, it's never been good.
Let me point out
what indication is there that it's going to get good? I mean, when is the situation with Israel and Palestine being good? Never.
Yeah.
When will it be good? Quite probably never.
Exactly. I'd like to point out that, the way I learned mundane astrology, which is what we're doing now, I learned to calibrate our interpretations toward the negative, which is my exact opposite practice with natal astrology, i.e. the astrology I practice for individuals. You see. It's the exact opposite. But, unfortunately, we're going to have to continue this discussion at some future show, Steve. We're coming down to the final stretches of our time here, and I would like to remind everyone that if they're intrigued by this material, and if they would like to open up some of these charts of nations and perhaps do a little forecasting themselves, if they're tired of listening to the media and only getting spoon-fed information from our government and the media and would like to learn astrology so that they can pick up charts and understand for themselves what's going to happen in the world, a great place to start is to pop on over to StephenFrampton.com, pick up Thinking Completely Outside the Box, his book, and read it. The very first section is going to give you a lot of astrological knowledge. Another alternative is to keep listening to the show. As this year progresses and the next year progresses, we're developing currently an entire pantheon, a suite of educational materials that will make you a very, very competent astrologer, tarot reader, and metaphysician in general. So by all means, sever your umbilical cord to the conventional media. You don't need them anymore.
The smoke machine.
Right. You don't need them anymore. They operate mainly to serve the interests of their advertisers and whatever whore masters are dictating. And they get their news from Reuters, the Associated Press.
The pimps are commonly criminality.
Let me tell you the worst invention conventional media for well over a decade. I tell you, accuracy, reliability, what they care about are advertising dollars, and they care about lawsuits. That's what they prefer to keep paranoid and afraid so that we'll watch. You see, but at any rate, I don't mean to sit up here and indict the media right now. That's a topic for another show. What I'm trying to do is
we'll do a whole show on that.
Right. What I'm trying to do is let everybody know that until we get our educational resources developed and released here, a great place to begin is by going over to StephenFrampton.com. And unlike myself, Stephen spells his name with a V. Okay, he's one of those Stephens. So he spells Stephen Frampton, and Frampton, of course, is just like you would expect. F-R-A-M as in Mary, P-T-O-N.com. By all means, diddy bop on over there. Pick up a copy of that book. Well worth every shekel. Read it. You're going to love it. After the primer section, there's an absolutely brilliant exposition of the Aurora Theater, Colorado shooting perpetrated by James Crapstain Holmes. May he inherit a hotel with 1,000 rooms and be found dead in every room, God forbid. And you know what? I'm not exactly chopped liver over here. I've, cordoned off my own little section of internet real estate. You can visit me at thegingerpsychic.com. Visit my services page. If you've got confusion about your life, need some direction, if you wonder when the money's going to come, if it's going to come, when's romance going to come, if it's going to come, what should I do, why was I born, what was I before, etc., all those answers, my services page. Schedule some time with me. You'll get answers to all your questions. That is thegingerpsychic.com. I also want to let everybody know that Steve and I collaborate as well with another outfit, psychicaccess.com. And on Thursday night, you can visit psychicaccesstalkradio.com. And the format for that show is much different from this one. It covers a wider variety of metaphysical subjects. We don't just cover on that show, for example, astrology. We also do tarot, mediumship, pet psychism. For example, my show next Thursday, this coming up Thursday on the 28th, I'm going to have Gail St. John on, reviewing her. She's one of those foremost psychic investigators and detectives. She doesn't call the police department up to beg them to let her cooperate with them. She calls them up and says, "I'm standing next to the body. Come get it." So don't miss that. PsychicAccessTalkRadio.com. You're going to want to check it out. And that's all I got, Steve. You got anything you want to tell our friends out in the audience, all 7 billion of them?
I think you've covered it, other than I really would like to ask our listeners to help us by circulating our show and sending out links to their friends or on Facebook, because, our intention is to help people to see that metaphysics is extremely valid and offers a great insight into many areas of life, including geopolitics and the economy, etc. So please help us by telling people about our show, about our work, and if you can increase our listenership from 7 billion to 7 billion and a dozen, then we're happy with that.
Also, Steve, I would like to send out a message to John the Jihadist, Jihadist John, the man who sawed off my compatriot's head. Mm-hmm. I got a message for that guy. You are a dead man. You are dead already without even realizing it, pal. And when you die, which I pray for every night, when you die, you're going to visit exactly what you worshipped, and you'll receive exactly what you have visited upon others. So I just want you to know that you're a dead man walking, Jihadist John.
You get what you focus on.
Absolutely. You live by that little short blade, buddy, and you're going to die by it. So I just want to send that message to you because I know you're listening. Our show is very popular in Syria.
In the Middle East.
Yeah, absolutely. Your life is over and you don't even realize it yet. And on that note, I'd like to wish everybody else a very, very fruitful, happy week, and we will see you guys next Friday night, 8 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Have a good one, everyone.